The lawyer's voice cracked as he read the final clause, and I watched my sister's face crumble like old paper. Rebecca had expected millions. Instead, she got $500,000 and the knowledge that a stranger named Sarah Chen had inherited everything else. The conference room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and my sister's sharp intake of breath. She turned to me, mascara already streaking, her expression screaming the question she couldn't voice. How could you let this happen? 3 weeks earlier, I'd driven through the familiar gates of Millbrook Manor for what I thought would be another obligatory visit. Dad had been dying for months, pancreatic cancer eating him from the inside out. The old man had always been secretive about his $47 million empire, built from a modest construction business into something that dominated half of Portland's skyline. Rebecca had called that morning, her voice tight with panic. Dad had changed his will just 3 days before he died. Changed everything. The first shock had been learning about Sarah Chen, a nurse who'd cared for Dad during his final weeks. Young, pretty, and now impossibly wealthy, Rebecca's attorney was already building a case around the obvious narrative. Experienced caregiver identifies wealthy. Isolated patient gains his trust, manipulates him into changing his will. It was a compelling story. It was also completely wrong. I'd met Sarah 3 months before Dad died, during one of my weekly prison sentence visits. She was adjusting his four when I walked in, her movements efficient and gentle. Dad was actually smiling, something I hadn't seen in years. What struck me wasn't her competence or her youth, it was her eyes. Dark brown, exactly like mine. The same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she listened. I'd seen those features before, in a photograph hidden behind loose boards in Dad's basement workshop. The photograph I'd found when I was 8 years old. The memory had stayed buried for decades, surfacing only during sleepless nights when I wondered why Dad treated me like a disappointment, despite every achievement I'd managed. Now, watching Sarah move around his bedroom with casual familiarity, everything clicked into place. The manila envelope marked personal DC, the beautiful woman holding a baby. The handwriting on the back. Sarah and David, 1995. Sarah Chen wasn't a manipulative caregiver, she was Dad's daughter, my half-sister. Rebecca's lawsuit was built on ignorance and assumptions. She'd hired Harrison, a sharp-faced attorney who specialized in will contests, and they'd constructed their case around Sarah's supposed sudden appearance in Dad's life. What they didn't know was that Dad had been sending money to Sarah's mother for 28 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars, transferred monthly through a shell company he'd created in the 80s. College tuition, medical bills, living expenses, everything a father should provide, hidden from his legitimate family. I could have told them. I could have saved Rebecca from the humiliation of a public trial. Instead, I let her dig her own grave. The years of criticism flooded back as I prepared for my testimony. Every time Dad had looked at me with disappointment, every achievement he'd dismissed, every choice he'd questioned, Rebecca had been his golden child, the daughter who'd married well and produced perfect grandchildren. She'd stood by silently while he'd torn me down, never once defending the brother who'd chosen teaching over profit. Now she expected my loyalty. She assumed I'd help her destroy the woman who'd received Dad's final gift. She'd never been more wrong about anything in her perfectly orchestrated life. Taking the stand felt like stepping into Dad's workshop that day. I was 8, reaching behind those loose boards to find something that would change everything. Harrison approached with the swagger of a man who thought he'd already won, ready to let me confirm their narrative about Sarah's manipulation. Instead, I told the truth. All of it. The photographs, the hidden payments, the shell company records I'd found in Dad's files. The journals where he'd documented his guilt over abandoning his daughter. Every secret he'd kept, every lie he'd told, every year he'd spent trying to bury his conscience with money and silence. When I finished, Rebecca looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Sarah was crying, not from sadness, but from relief. Someone had finally acknowledged her existence, validated the truth she'd carried alone for decades. The judge ruled in Sarah's favor within an hour. The evidence was overwhelming once I'd laid it out. Decades of documentation proving Dad had been supporting his secret daughter. Proving the will change wasn't manipulation but recognition. Rebecca stormed out without speaking to me, her attorney trailing behind like a wounded animal. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not just because I'd hurt Rebecca, though that satisfaction ran deeper than I wanted to admit, but because I'd finally found a way to honor the better parts of who Dad might have been. The phone call came 2 days later. Rebecca's voice tight with fury and something else, fear. She'd finally understood that my betrayal hadn't been spontaneous. I'd known about Sarah long before the will reading, long before the lawsuit, long before any of us had heard her name spoken aloud. She was right. I'd been planning this moment for months. Ever since that first meeting with Sarah when I'd recognized my own eyes looking back at me. But there was one final detail even Sarah didn't know. Something I'd found in Dad's desk the night after the funeral. A letter, sealed and marked for Michael, open only after my death. Inside, Dad had written about his regrets, about choosing money over family, about the son he'd pushed away because I reminded him too much of his own failures. But the last paragraph was what mattered. He'd known I found the photographs years ago. Known I'd kept his secret. The will change wasn't just about making amends to Sarah. It was about finally acknowledging me as the son he could trust with the truth. Rebecca had spent 35 years being the perfect daughter, collecting Dad's approval like trophies on a shelf. She'd gotten nothing but pocket change. I'd spent 35 years being the disappointment, the son who'd chosen books over blueprints, students over profit margins. I'd gotten everything. The old man had played us all from the grave, but in the end, he'd chosen the right son. He'd bet on the disappointment, and for once in his calculating life, it was the smartest money he'd ever spent. So, this the end of the story from my side. Share your thoughts in the comments section and I will reply them all. See you tomorrow with another story.